Alright guys, Willem here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back with another Survivor recasting video. This one kind of being a humorous one in my mind, one that I've been wanting to do for a bit, where here I will be recasting Survivor Caramoan if it was fans versus favorites too, which it obviously wasn't by looking at the cast. Which again, has just been a humorous concept in my mind of redoing this cast under what the cast was probably supposed to be, where I've kind of done a similar thing to this with Survivor Game Changers in the past. However, here for Caramoan, which is obviously commonly ridiculed for its fans versus favorites theme, with having a tribe of fans that most of which weren't real fans, and a tribe of favorites that weren't real favorites. And I feel like trying to make a cast that rectifies that was an interesting concept, though I will say in execution here, especially on the favorite side of things, I do feel like this was kind of a tough grouping to put together, considering the entire moniker of favorites, as typically you would assume being people that were well liked by the public. Fully leaning into that notion is something that makes it very tough to cast, to where I don't think it's really possible. Where here I still want to keep with this Caramoan trend of only casting people from the last fans versus favorites on, but even beyond that, I mean, there's the limit of like who would have wanted to come back and whatnot, as I did want to keep this a semi-realistic cast. So because that, again, it did end up not really turning out the way I exactly wanted to on the favorite side of things, though I do think the fan side of things probably works out a bit better. But either way, again, we'll be running through the entire cast, replacing the fans with actual fans, people that later played the game that are fans of the show, while also replacing some of the favorites with a few changes there as well. So with that, let's just start running through the list. Where do you feel like the actual more interesting side of things is the fans? So because I think we'll start off with the favorites, where I'll be going through them in boot order here, starting it off with Francesca. And I mean, obviously we're switching out Francesca. I mean, Francesca being on a favorites tribe is just ridiculous, and it's funny that that's the way they approach this. Is obviously they very much wanted to build up this Francesca versus Philip rivalry. However, it just straight up doesn't really make much sense to have her on a favorites tribe. However, when looking at like who I could have switched her out with, I think that makes it a little tougher. I think my first instinct was someone like a Taj, though obviously Taj declined this season, so she couldn't be on. And again, in a similar light, there were just other people that also declined this season in real life, people like a Shambo, who would have possibly been in the running. Also, Lisa Welcher, I'm pretty sure would have said no as well. So the person I did end up picking here ends up being Sabrina from Survivor One World, who I believe was in the casting process for this season, and even if not, then was obviously later in the casting process for Second Chance, was up for public vote there, was also in the process for Game Changers, I believe. Like, she is someone that obviously production very much wanted to bring back at some point, and it's someone that, again, fits the favorites moniker a bit more. Now, was she actually a favorite? I think that's a bit questionable. Again, she wasn't really in the top tier of the fan favorite award for One World, so again, by that qualification, she doesn't really fit. Though again, she is a runner-up of the show. She did come off as largely likable on the show. I really don't see a reason why she wouldn't be here over someone like a Francesca if we're fully buying into the favorites moniker. Next, moving on to Brandon Hance, and I mean, obviously Brandon Hance doesn't make it either. Now, Brandon Hance, again, was not a favorite, was he? Having him back as a favorite, and also having him back over a few other options was kind of ridiculous to me. Now, in terms of the person to replace him, I do think it's a bit tough. Now, in terms of who to replace him with, I do feel like there are a few considerations. Now, from earlier on Survivor history, I did at first consider someone like a Jervis or someone like a Varner or a Savage, these people that later come back in future seasons. However, I decided again to stick with just more recent seasons at this point. I personally would have liked to see Jim Rice back over Brandon, though at the end of the day, Jim Rice is also not really a favorite. And the same thing goes with someone like a Marty as well. Or the person I did end up going with here is someone that is probably the person I would have wanted to see back the least of the three, though obviously ends up being the most likely of these three to return, considering it does later come back. And that person is Troyzan from One World, who did end up coming very close to being on the actual season here. I mean, he was supposedly replaced by Malcolm at the last second, and again, like, that could make you think, okay, well then they're not going to put him on the same cast as Malcolm, though they later do in Game Changers, with them literally being on the same tribe. So again, like, I do feel like Troyzan is someone that, if we're keeping to the favorites moniker, I do feel like he fits more. I mean, obviously the online fan base was not a big fan of Troyzan at this point. However, Troyzan was number 2 in the fan favorite poll of One World. Like, he was pretty popular at the time, and considering this is being filmed immediately after One World's airing, I do feel like Troyzan would have fit the favorites moniker more than Brandon Hance here. Next, I'm moving on to Corinne, and this is where the overall concept of the favorites becomes more tested to me, where my initial instinct is to obviously take out Corinne, as Corinne isn't a favorite. She was actually really disliked by most of the fan base, especially the more casual fan base. However, one, obviously she is still a very likely returnee. I obviously have no qualms with her being brought back here, though beyond that, also, there's not really anyone to truly replace her with. I mean, we're looking at the pool of people, there's not that many female favorites in particular that are eligible for this list. People that are from the 16 to 25 era of the show, these people that were genuinely well-liked. Now, I think maybe if we're looking at Philippines, maybe someone like an RC could have been someone to consider, though I think at the end of the day, again, Corinne is someone that, despite her not being a favorite, I do feel like she is a very likely returnee. And again, looking back at the original fans versus favorites, I mean, when you had someone like a Fair Play or even like a Penner, these people who aren't really favorites, though are still very likely returnees. Like Corinne is obviously in that mold to where I decided to keep her on the cast. And the same thing goes to the next person, who is probably one of the least favorite people on this favorites tribe, and that person is Philip, who obviously was, again, not well liked by the public. People did not like Philip. However, Philip was still one of the biggest locks to return at this point in Survivor history. I mean, he was such a massive character on Redemption Island, and to not have Philip back at an opportunity where he would have wanted it not too long after a season, again, it doesn't really make sense to me. But again, he is not a favorite, and I do think if we're going for more of a favorite sort of moniker, I do feel like swapping out for like Jervis, who obviously later comes back the following season, would have made sense, or even from Redemption Island itself, people like a Matt, people like a Mike would have made sense, though one, again, Matt didn't want to come back, and Mike, again, supposedly was in the running for this season, though had to turn it down. So again, there's not really anyone to truly replace him with, to where, again, like I do feel like Philip is obviously still a massive character to where he still made it on for me. Next, I'm moving on to Malcolm, and again, Malcolm is probably the definitive pick here in terms of he literally just came from the last season. He obviously was going to be a massive favorite, and he's someone that obviously no one had any qualms with returning here. I mean, there's really no question that Malcolm easily makes the cut here. Next, I'm moving on to Andrea, and Andrea is kind of a weird one to me, to where after Redemption Island, having Andrea come back is not the worst thing in the world in my eyes. However, it's also something that I wouldn't have picked for myself at this point in Survivor history. I do feel like Andrea doesn't really qualify as a favorite in my mind. I don't feel like Andrea was particularly popular, though also when mixing that in with the fact that she's not really a massive name like a Corinne or a Philip, it does make me question why was she even on here. To where, while Andrea is probably more so a favorite nowadays, I do think Andrea would qualify in the modern day, I do feel like at the time, immediately after Redemption Island, I would not have put Andrea on. So I decided to swap Andrea out for another person from Survivor One World, which again, this ends up being a season with no One World representation, which is kind of weird. This recasting video has now made it 3 people, but anyway, here I did put on Chelsea, who's obviously one of the runners up on the season. And through that, again, having her on with Sabrina is kind of a bit questionable, as it's a bit overpowered, though at the same time they did that with other people in the actual season. But Chelsea, again, is more in line with the favorite. Again, she makes it further into the game, actually makes it to the very end. She has more of a redemption storyline in my eyes. Also was someone that was at least towards the top of the fan favorite award, where she was in the top 4 at least, to where at least there's more justification in that light as well. And I really feel like no one came out of One World thinking negatively of Chelsea, unlike Andrea, who, like, again, people were upset at Andrea for betraying Matt and just following Boston Rob. And I feel like Chelsea definitely had a more positive reception from the fan base, to where I decided to go with Chelsea here. Next, I'm moving on to Brenda, and Brenda was someone I was a bit conflicted on, in the fact that Brenda is someone that obviously fits into the cast. I mean, she's not a favorite, but again, she's kind of more in line with the Corinne and the Philip mold of this big character. Everyone knew she was going to come back. However, my issue with Brenda here is the fact that she clearly didn't want to be there, where immediately after starting the season, I mean, she supposedly really just crumbled on the island and got really homesick and really just didn't really want to be there. So at that point for me, it's like, well, then why am I putting this person on the cast? Now, again, I think from a pure casting standpoint, it makes full sense to put Brenda there, but I think knowing her out of game situation, it makes me not want to put Brenda on the cast. So because I did take Brenda out of the cast, but to be fair, I think I'm replacing her with someone pretty good here, in the fact that I am replacing her with Natalie Bolton. Now, I'm not 100% if Natalie Bolton would have been willing to come back at this point in Survivor history, though I also don't know that she wouldn't, And I feel like, again, kind of in the same light as a certain other person we're about to talk about, I think it would have been cool to have Natalie Bolton, this original fan, quote unquote, on the actual favorites tribe for the next fans versus favorite season. Again, it is kind of a cool trend to have here. And I do feel like having Natalie here would have been really fun to see. Now, again, at the end of the day, I can argue also keeping Brenda on the cast. I do think Brenda is still a very worthy returnee, though I just feel like knowing how the season plays out and knowing her state of mind coming into the season, I feel like we're probably better off getting a different person here because I did put Natalie Bolton on. Next up, moving on to obviously the aforementioned player, that being Eric Reichenbach. And I mean, Eric's still on the cast. I mean, obviously Eric is the original fan, now on the favorites tribe. That's a cool transition there. Also, the fact that Eric would have this rivalry with Natalie here, I think that could be an interesting dynamic as well. And also, Eric was just someone that was actually genuinely liked at the time. I mean, while people called him an idiot, obviously, for giving up his immunity necklace, I mean, he was still one of the more popular players of that season, where I do feel like having him on this season makes a lot of sense. Now, again, I think there's an argument that he could also fall into his Brenda situation of him not being in the right mind space, but I do feel like that more so came from his deprivation on the island, more so than just his overall state of mind coming into the season. So because I still decided to keep Eric on. Next, I'm moving on to Dawn. And Dawn is one that I question as well. Where for me, Dawn comes off very similar to Andrea in the fact that I don't have an issue necessarily for returning, but it's also not one that I personally would have picked. And it's also one that I was a bit confused by at the time. I mean, to me, Dawn really didn't do anything that memorable to warrant a return. So because I did end up replacing her here, and I feel like there's a very easy pick in my mind for a person to replace her with, and that person is Holly from Survivor Nicaragua, who I believe was also in the running for this season at the time. And again, it just makes more sense to me. Again, Holly is someone that makes it further than Dawn, got a bigger edit than Dawn. I mean, was someone that had this big journey edit that I do feel like resonated with the audience. And while she wasn't necessarily at the top of the fan favorite poll for that season, unlike a Jane, who I did not put on, I feel like Holly just seems like the type of person that production would be more willing to bring back than someone like a Jane. So I never really got the sense that Jane was someone that was ever actually going to be brought back. And overall, I just feel like Holly kind of fits the mold of this season a bit better in my mind, especially the lack of Nicaragua representation at this point. So I decided to put Holly on the cast. And finally, obviously, the last person we got to be talking about from the favorite tribe here is Cochrane. And I mean, Cochrane's one of the bigger locks on the board. And as much as people don't like Cochrane on the online community, Cochrane was very popular at the time. I mean, he was second in the fan favorite poll for South Pacific to Ozzy. And I think at this point in Survivor history, just everyone knew Cochrane was going to eventually come back and play Survivor. Again, I don't think there was any doubt about Cochrane being on this season. And because of that, it just makes a lot of sense. Now, again, at the end of the day, I would have also considered someone like a Stephen Fishback, who supposedly was also in the running, and Cochrane probably took his spot. Though again, if we're going by popularity and the actual favorite title, I do feel like Cochrane fits more so as a favorite, so because that he easily made the cut here. And now for the fan side of things, which just straight up is a complete overhaul of the original fans tribe. Of the 10 people on the original fans tribe, only 2 of those people remained on the cast here. And again, some of that's because obviously the original fans tribe was not really a fans tribe. Only half of the tribe, I guess, were actual fans. But even then, I feel like there were just bigger fans to get than the fans that they could have gotten here, to where, again, I completely overhauled the tribe here using pretty much just players from the next few seasons. Mostly people from Survivors Cagayan and Worlds Apart, but also some from San Juan del Sur as well. And through that, I think it makes it a much stronger tribe, especially under the fan moniker. Well, with that, let's run through the tribe again in boot order here, and let's start off with Allie. And Allie is someone that, to give credit to her, is actually a fan. At least there's that. She is someone that was a big fan of the show. Or I still did decide to cut Allie. Now, this is one that I think is probably the cut that probably is the most superfluous. I think it is the one that does probably the least here. However, the main reason I decided to cut Allie is because usually when talking about this fans tribe, a lot of people get the Allies, the Hopes, the Lauras mixed up, largely because they're all seemingly similar archetypes. And because I did decide to just keep one of those 3, and through that swapped Allie out. But realistically, again, Allie is still a solid enough pick for this tribe. But I did end up swapping her out with someone from Survivor Cagayan, that being Alexis Maxwell. Now again, is this that big of a change? Not really. But again, I feel like Alexis is in a similar archetype to Allie, though at least looks different, to where we don't have a tribe full of blonde women. While I did consider the likes of like a Haley or a Jen for this spot as well, I feel like Alexis was probably the one that fits most into this fan moniker, so I went with her here. Next, I'm moving on to Hope, who I also took off the cast, but this one being a lot more justified. Again, Hope is someone that was not a fan of the show, got recruited because of her pageant background, and again, kind of easy to cut her here. However, to replace her, and this is not a one-for-one replacement, however, again, it shouldn't be, as I feel like the overall fans tribe was very lacking in terms of diversity, where there was a lot of Mactor types, a lot of similar looking people, and because of that, I decided to swap Hope out here for Tasha from Survivor Kakian, who, again, was also a massive fan. Obviously, just ends up being on the show a cycle later. I do feel like Tasha would have been a great person to have on this tribe here. Also being able to bolster the physicality of this tribe, where we do see the fans tribe lacking down the road, and to be fair, I mean, she was on the Brains tribe, which was a disaster, but still, again, Tasha was still one of the better comp competitors of that group, so I decided to put Tasha on here. Next, moving on to Shamar, and Shamar obviously didn't make the cut either. Again, another one that was recruited and wasn't a fan. However, Shamar, there were a number of people that I could have replaced him with, and really this goes for any of the men that end up being replaced here, but you do have the likes of a Mike Holloway, who I very much considered, though I did feel like having him on this tribe would have been a bit overkill, considering just how much more physical he is, especially when comparing him to even most of the people on the favorites tribe. And the same thing goes to someone like a Joe as well. I considered Tony, who would have been really fun to have here. I believe Tony was actually in consideration for the original Caramoan. However, I decided to leave him off mainly because, again, like, as much as I love Tony, he's not really someone that I feel like is a massive fan. Like, he is a fan of the show, but I feel like it's a lot more of a casual fan than someone that would actually be declared a fan on a fans versus favorite season. Also consider a couple of people beyond just those seasons that I mentioned. Someone like a Chris Hammond, someone like a Brendan Shapiro. These people who, while they don't appear until much later in Survivor history, they're people that had been applying for years before getting on the show. I do feel like they would have fit into this group as well. Brendan Shapiro is probably the person that was the closest to making it on. Though, again, I feel like he kind of fits into the archetype of the person I did actually put on, and that person is Jeremy Collins, who obviously ends up becoming a winner down the road. Obviously later appears in San Juan del Sur, and again is one of these people that had been applying for years leading into his eventual appearance, and I do feel like putting him on this cast here would make a lot of sense, considering he is a big fan. And also, spoiler for down the road, I am getting rid of Eddie, to where Jeremy's also obviously a firefighter, so that kind of fits into that as well. Like, I feel like Jeremy does a lot to really boon this tribe, so yeah, he didn't make the cut here. Next up, the only woman I end up keeping on this tribe ends up being Laura Alexander, who, again, like, out of Allie, Hope, and Laura, I decided to keep Laura. I felt like Laura was the biggest fan of the bunch, seemed to be the player that had the most potential as well. I feel like Laura can kind of just perfectly fits into this tribe, so again, she easily remained on the cast here. Next up is someone that I did swap out, though I didn't feel great about it, I'll be honest, and that person is Matt Bischoff, who I like Matt. I mean, he is obviously still a fan, and through that, again, does qualify for this list. However, I did question with this list how big of a fan he is. And again, this could get super nitpicky, but I do feel like in comparison to some of the other people that later get on their show in the next few seasons, I do feel like Matt just kind of feels like less of a fan than some of these other people. So I just decided to swap him out, and the person I decided to swap him out for is someone that isn't particularly popular, though I thought it would be super funny to have Dan Foley on this tribe, where, again, Dan Foley's another one of these people that had been applying since the very beginning of the show, constantly applying every season until he finally got on Worlds Apart. However, again, why not put him on the fans tribe here? Again, he would have had this great story about how he's been applying for years, finally got on. He fits the fan moniker. I do feel like Dan Foley would have been humorous to have on this tribe, so I put him on. Next up, moving on to Julia, who is another one that could easily be swapped out. Again, another one that was not a fan of the show, didn't really know anything about it, so the question is who to replace her with, and this is another one I didn't feel the need to like keep this one-on-one comparison here. I'm just going to straight up pick one of the bigger fans on the board here, and that person is Shireen from Survivor Worlds Apart. Again, a person that I think perfectly fits the fan moniker. Now, in terms of realism, I don't know if Shireen was really in the casting pool at this point, but still, she's obviously a massive fan of the show, would constantly quote and make references to things on the show while out there. Like, a major aspect of her character on the show is how much of a fan she is. And I do feel like having Shireen on the fans tribe just makes a lot of sense here. So again, she made it on there. Next, moving on to Michael, who ends up being the only guy on this tribe to remain on the tribe. And again, Michael still perfectly fits this super fan moniker, massive fan of the show. Now, I did consider replacing him with the likes of a Josh or a Reed, who obviously later appeared in San Juan del Sur. Tyler, who are also massive fans of the show as well, though I decided just to not completely overhaul the entire group, especially when like this change would have been very marginal, really was for almost no purpose. I decided, okay, let's just keep Michael on here for the sake of it. Next, moving on to Ronald. And Ronald, as much as I do like Ronald as a character, I do feel like he is, again, another one of these that isn't a fan of the show. Got recruited, didn't know much about the show until after he got cast, so I am going to swap him out. Now the question is who to swap him out with, and really there were two Survivor 30 people that I considered here. Two people that were actually in the running for the original Caramoan. The first of which being Tyler Fredrickson, who initially was on this cast. I did initially want him on here to add to the physicality of the group, though I kind of decided it wasn't 100% necessary, especially considering the other person has a much more interesting storyline, and that person is Max Dawson. Now, Max technically was recruited for Survivor, though obviously it's because he was a massive fan to begin with and had become a professor on a class based around Survivor. And that entire storyline is obviously really interesting, especially from a fans tribe perspective. Again, if you're on the fans tribe, what's a better storyline than you literally creating an entire course based around the show of Survivor? So again, for me, I feel like Max Dawson just makes a lot of sense here. He was even in the casting pool at this point, was almost on the actual season, so I thought Max made the perfect pick here. Next, moving on to Eddie, and as I mentioned earlier, Eddie is obviously not on the cast here, and the person to replace him with here is, again, not a one-for-one comparison, though still a younger guy, athletic enough, was on a season not too far afterwards, and that person is Spencer from Survivor Cagayan. And again, Spencer is obviously just a massive fan of the show coming into it, and overall just like kind of perfectly fits the fan moniker here, while also being like decent in challenges. Now, I don't know if they 100% knew that coming into it, but really, I think you can argue he's a better challenge competitor than Eddie, who was a firefighter. And also considering a later pick as well, I think the entire concept of having so many original Brains members on a fans tribe is also just kind of a humorous concept to me, so because I did put Spencer on here. And finally, the last person on the board to talk about is Sherry, who I did also end up replacing. Now again, at the end of the day, Sherry is not a bad pick for the fans tribe. She was at least a fan of the show. However, she also wasn't that big of a fan from what I understand. Again, she was more so a casual fan where like her husband was the bigger fan. Oh, again, she still knew a lot of the players. Was one of the only people freaking out at seeing the actual favorites coming out of the helicopter, which is humorous, though. Again, like I think at the end of the day, I think there's probably bigger fans to be getting here, and the person I did get is the aforementioned other Brain member, and that person is Cass. And again, like Cass, incredible casting, was on only a cycle later, supposedly had been applying for a while, was even around the Survivor community since the very beginning. Like I just feel like Cass perfectly fits the fan moniker. And again, have her end up on a tribe with the likes of a Spencer and a Tasha, who she has a much more hostile relationship with in their actual season, I think is an interesting concept as well. So again, I did put her on here. But there we go, and that is my recasting of Survivor Caramoan. If it was actually fans versus favorites, here on the fan tribe, I do have Alexis Maxwell, Dan Foley, Jeremy Collins, Cass McQuillan, Laura Alexander, Max Dawson, Michael Snow, Shireen Oskui, Spencer Bledsoe, and Tasha Fox. While on the favorites tribe, I do have Chelsea Meisner, Corinne Kaplan, Eric Reichenbach, Holly Hoffman, John Cochrane, Malcolm Freeberg, Natalie Bolton, Philip Shepard, Sabrina Thompson, and Troyzanne Robertson. So that's another recasting video in the books. Now moving forward, I still have a wide number of recasting videos I do want to do at some point down the road. And obviously just in general, expect more Survivor, Big Brother, other reality TV, other different types of videos down the road. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.